Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us today for our Future Feed Explorers Series webinar entitled Becoming CMC Assessment Ready, Making Your Assessor's Job Easier and Your Assessment Smoother. Today's webinar is being recorded. All attendees will receive an email with a link to the recording. You can enter questions during the webinar into the Zoom platform, and we'll try to answer as many as we can at the end of the presentation. We'll also send out a separate email with answers to any questions we aren't able to get to. And today's webinar is sponsored by FutureFeed and by SecureCentric. FutureFeed is the leading cyber GRC platform for the defense industrial base. And like TurboTax, but for CMMC, FutureFeed guides organizations through the entire CMMC journey, from defining scope and addressing NIST 800-171 requirements to managing security controls, policies, assets, to assessment readiness and maintaining continuous compliance. SecureCentric is a trusted leader in CMMC compliance solutions dedicated to helping organizations navigate the complexities of cybersecurity standards. SecureCentric provides innovative strategies that redefine compliance and assurance in the face of evolving threats. Well, the Future Feed Explorers webinar series was created to arm defense contractors with the information you need to understand and address the requirements of CMMC. And throughout the series, we'll share critical insights from industry experts and best practices for achieving and sustaining CMMC compliance. Equally important, we'll share the why behind the CMMC program and its requirements. And while the focus of many organizations is on receiving a CMMC certification, the real objective must be ensuring their ability to protect the sensitive information with which they are entrusted and the information that they create. CMMC can't be approached as a checkbox exercise. It needs to be viewed as a corporate and as an individual responsibility to secure our nation's supply chain from our adversaries. Today's webinar focuses on an important milestone that organizations seeking certification must achieve. That milestone is successfully passing an assessment. As we'll discuss, you can successfully address all 110 controls and their 320 assessment objectives and still fail to pass your assessment. Today, we'll talk about what it means and what you need to do to be prepared to pass your assessment. And by the way, if you happen to miss it, the CFR Title 48 CMMC final rule was published in the Federal Register last week, and it becomes effective on November 10th. And this is when CMMC requirements can begin appearing in contracts and solicitations. We did a webinar earlier this week unpacking 48 CFR, explaining your obligations under the CMMC program and reviewing the program's rollout timeline so you can know what to expect when. And we'll include a link to the replay of that webinar in the email we'll send out to everyone who is joining us today. My name is Stuart Itkin. I am the CRO and Chief Security Evangelist at FutureFeed. Much of my career has centered on supply chain and vendor risk management and on regulatory compliance. I formerly served as a member of the CMMC Standards Working Group and participated in the establishment of the CMMC accreditation body, which is now the Cyber AB. I'm also a founding board member of the MSPs for the Protection of Critical Infrastructure and a director of the CMMC Industry Standards Council. And joining me today are Rachel Leidy and Delora Rosario. Rachel Leidy is Director of Compliance Education here at FutureFeed and is an experienced cybersecurity professional with over 15 years experience implementing and assessing frameworks, including NIST 800-171 and 853. Rachel is a CISSP, a certified CMMC assessor, and a certified CMMC professional. Her background spans service in the U.S. Navy and direct support of the DoD. Rachel brings a unique real-world perspective to cybersecurity and compliance. Delora Rosario is the Chief Risk and Resilience Officer for SecureCentric. Delora has spent 30 years turning cybersecurity chaos into strategic clarity. Today, as a CMMC registered practitioner, she's helping the defense industrial base organizations transform compliance nightmares into competitive advantage. Delora is a former U.S. Army cyber veteran, former CISO, and Fortune 500 leader who has mastered the art of making complex regulations make sense. So, Rachel, Delora, first, thank you both for your service and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
So let me start with a well-recognized quotation from Benjamin Franklin. It says, "By failing to prepare, you're preparing to fail." The CMMC assessment process, or the CAP, is a well-defined procedure that every assessor, every assessment team will follow. And Rachel is going to be explaining that process to us in a few minutes. The CAP assures consistency, that everyone will be assessed the same way, independent of the C3PAO they choose. But as Delora is going to tell us, choosing the right C3PAO for you is important. Similarly, the grading scale, the manner in which each assessment objective will be scored either as met or not met, is rigorous, it's well defined, and intended to be consistently applied. The point is, when it comes to your CMMC assessment, you can't wing it. Try to wing it, and you'll most likely get a second opportunity to go through the assessment process. Being prepared is absolutely crucial. And if you don't feel you're 100% ready to take the test, then you're probably not. And again, you can have put in the work to address every control, every assessment objective, and still fail the assessment if you're not ready. And when it comes to ready, you need to think about there being two types of ready. There's being technically ready. Technically ready, you've implemented all 110 controls, you've met all 320 assessment objectives, you're following the policies and procedures you've established, but you also need to be assessment ready. You need to be fully prepared to take the test, to successfully complete the third-party CMMC assessment. And that's what we're going to focus on today, what you need to do to be assessment ready. So, Delora, I know many organizations, they treat their assessment, whether it's their C3PAO assessment or it's their annual self-assessment, kind of as an event. Is that the right way for them to look at it? How should organizations treat their assessment?
And that's one of the biggest challenges that organizations might face is, it's not unusual for us to get questionnaires on a regular basis, and we're filling in responses to different assessments all the time. And you mentioned earlier that Future Feed is a little like, tax preparation software to helping you put it all together, right? The last thing we want is for our organizations to treat things like it's tax season and that you only have to look at it right before it's due. Instead, it should be kind of incorporated into the fabric of the culture of the organization. It should become business as usual to look at the types of risks that you have and how they may impact the business, with an idea that we want to be a resilient business. And so what decisions do we make that can help our business become more resilient? And then, keep in mind that the assessment is a validation of all of the work that you've done, from a cultural perspective, from a technical perspective, from a documentation perspective. And so this is an opportunity for you to shine. And so if you break things up into business as usual ideology, that can mean something like putting things into sprints, where we understand what our backlog is. And so we groom that backlog on a regular basis. And we start to break our control reviews into bite-sized snacks, and we serve them up at a compliance coffee, for example. If I know a particular engineering team is struggling with some of the compliance issues, then perhaps I bring donuts and we have a conversation about it when we look at those compliance issues. But what we want to do is recognize that it is now part of what we have to do on a regular basis to assess our risk and understand the impacts to our control environment and ultimately to the business resilience. We can reduce a lot of assessment anxiety by having practiced and become mature at how we address those risks.
And I think it's important to note that when you look at 48 CFR, the final rule, it very clearly states that CMMC is not a point-in-time assessment, but there is a very clear obligation to maintain continuous compliance. And I think what you're suggesting is very consistent with that. And we talked about documentation. I mean, your policies, procedures, the objective evidence, I mean, they all play a big role in completing the assessment. There's organizing the documentation, curating it for the assessment. I know that Rachel's going to talk about that a little bit later, but the first thing organizations need to do is they need to gather their documentation. I've seen this turn into a fire drill at some organizations as they prepare for their assessment. But Delora, how should organizations approach gathering documentation?
Well, like you mentioned already, it's documentation heavy when it's a maturity assessment, because we can't just point to an access policy. We need to actually develop the documentation and the procedures for how we determine access is permitted, when is it prevented, and where is the evidence that the procedures for doing those things have actually occurred in your environment on a regular basis for every access request. What organizations sometimes make the mistake of doing is creating a piece of evidence for the purpose of the assessment that doesn't really demonstrate the effectiveness of the control, or that it has been maintained over time and performed on a continuous basis. And so, you know, you want the documentation to be aligned to the control objectives, and serve the purpose of demonstrating that you've implemented the policy and used the procedure that were defined, in order to protect the information that we're all trying to protect. And you want to invite, because evidence can be very difficult to produce or to locate in an organization. You want to incentivize the idea that producing this evidence provides a benefit to the organization, not just for the purpose of this assessment, but it also provides you an opportunity for continuous improvement. And so the documentation should be organized in a way that is both useful for an assessor, but also for the organization to understand itself so that it can take advantage of lessons that are learned along the way and provide opportunities for continuous improvement.
And I think, Delora, I mean, it's important for organizations to recognize who the audience is for the documentation that they're creating. The policies, the procedures, they're not for the assessor, are they? They're for the organization.
That's right. That's right. And if you've produced documentation that is solely for the purpose of the assessor and it hasn't been implemented in the organization, it becomes very evident very quickly because the policy, procedure, and evidence do not align. When it's performed over time, then you'll have volumes of information that's available to produce for an assessor because you've been doing the policy and you've been doing the procedure, and it's continuous and repeated. It's a mature, repeatable process. And ultimately, CMMC is a maturity assessment. So not only do you have to have the policies and procedures and the controls in place, but you as an organization have to have culturally adopted it in a way that demonstrates that this has become your way of being, that you are mature in these practices.
Absolutely. It's about the need to focus on being secure as an organization and really making it almost a religion. So thank you for helping us understand kind of how to approach the assessment and certainly understanding it shouldn't be a fire drill, that it shouldn't be treated as an event, that it doesn't, and it actually doesn't need to be painful. But let's talk about the assessment itself and what you should expect. So Rachel, as I mentioned, the process is well defined in the CAP. Can you walk us through the process?
I can, but it's quite the process, so I can't touch on every task or step within the process, the overall certification process. But I will highlight some key steps along the way. I just want to start by saying, like, assessments don't have to be scary, and once you sit through your first assessment, I feel like you're going to go into the next one a lot more prepared and a lot less anxious. But the assessment is to evaluate maturity, right? So thank you, Delora, for bringing that point up early on in the conversation. Is NIST 800-171 is you need to be compliant with 800-171 at all times. It's continuous implementation of the security requirements and your controls that you've designed and implemented. And without continuous implementation and the solid documentation, you don't really have maturity, right? So that's what we're doing in an assessment, is evaluating your implementation of NIST 800-171, and I'll talk here soon in phase 2 about some ways that we evaluate that. So, but let's first bring up phase 0, I like to call it, or just the preliminary proceedings phase. This is the pre-assessment phase, and this is where you're going to select and engage your C3PAO. And then before moving into this phase, approach it with the mindset that Delora had brought up: maturity, documentation, be prepared to tell the story and not try to find the answers in your GRC tool or a policy that was given to you. Phase 1, this is where you're going to meet with the C3PAO assessment team and communicate your assessment scope. You're going to have that scoping call. This is extremely important, and it's valuable for you as the OSC just as much as it's valuable for the C3PAO. I'm an assessor, so from an assessor's point of view, it's really important for me to understand the environment I'm about to be assessing. So when, for example, I get to a technical objective, I know what that implementation looks like on a Linux system versus a cloud Windows box. From your point of view, and for the OSCs in today's session, is it's really important, and use it as a tool to not only, I mean, they're using it as a tool, the C3PAO, to determine your readiness, but that is also a tool for you to really solidify and feel ready for that assessment. Because if you move into that assessment with an unclear scope yourself, you're not sure what your scope is, then that's a big red flag that you're not prepared. So be prepared to have that scoping discussion and really talk about the different components and technologies that are involved. After you have that scoping discussion and your C3PAO determines readiness, they're going to conduct an in-brief, and then you're going to move into phase 2. So phase 2 is the actual assessment, and the assessment time overall has reduced as organizations are learning more how to be prepared for these assessments. But depending on your size of the environment, 1 week assessment, 2 week assessment, but I've seen assessments happen in 3 days. Not from myself, just word of mouth. I've heard that they've been only lasting a couple days. And that really probably is because that organization was ready, prepared to give the assessment, prepared to tell a story of their compliance. So in this assessment phase, here, what we're going to do is we're determining that maturity in that implementation. So we're going to, all assessors are taught to use 2 of the 3 assessment methods per requirement. Okay, the 3 assessment methods are interview, examine, and test. So during an assessment, I am going to be interviewing you most likely on all 110 controls, because I need to interview. You've already given me your body of evidence in phase 1, so I've already examined a lot of that documentation that you have. I may request more documentation along the way, but we're going to be interviewing the folks responsible for doing what is said on paper. So that way, if their answers are different than what's on paper, what's the issue? maybe we're not as mature in that process as we thought we are. And then we close out that assessment by kicking or hosting an outbrief where we talk about the results, and you will need to provide your hashed body of evidence post-assessment phase 3. If you met the conditions, which I will show you in the next slide, then your final certification is 100%. I'm sorry, that should not say, oh yeah, it's 100% of controls met for final certification, okay? 100% of the controls need to be met. For conditional certification, it means you had some failures, and those failures were allowed to be put on an assessment POAM. So now you have 180 days to remediate, re-engage a C3PAO, and get that revalidated within that 180 days so you can close out and get your certification. If you've failed in that revalidation or reassessment, or if you failed certain controls up front, then you just need to step back, reevaluate your implementation, your maturity, your readiness, and schedule a whole new C3PAO assessment. Now, after you get your certification, the work's not done. I think we've said enough. It's continuous implementation. So now once you get your certificate, you're good for a certain amount of time, triennial certification or assessment requirements. And so start planning for that future assessment. But throughout the next couple years, make sure you're doing your continuous monitoring requirements and your annual security control requirements, your annual attestation, and just maintaining the implementation of those controls throughout that contract life cycle, certification life cycle, data life cycle. I think I said more than I planned to. Next slide. So here I won't, the next slide, I'm just showing the POAM eligibility conditions at the different levels. So I won't go into this too much, but just know that there are, when we're talking about level 2 certification assessments, there are certain requirements that you cannot fail. And if you do fail these during the assessment, then it's a stop. You'll have to restart the whole process in the future when you're ready. But there are some control requirements that you can fail during the assessment, and those are the ones that you have 180 days to remediate and get revalidated. All right.
Okay, Rachel, so thanks. And before I start off in this, I think apologies to Peter Townsend. But as you noted, I mean, one of the first things that will happen during the actual assessment is that the assessment team is going to conduct an in-brief, and they're going to read the in-brief. You know, their in-brief will be virtually the same for every organization they assess. They're going to introduce the assessment team. They'll explain the process they're going to follow. They'll share other information about the assessment, but then it's your turn. And this is an opportunity many OSCs fail to take advantage of. You know, the people on your C3PAO assessment team, they may have never worked in a business. They likely know nothing about your company nor understand what you do. The last company they may have assessed, you know, likely looks nothing like yours. It could have been a manufacturing company or a construction company, an engineering company, a software company, a maintenance company. Point is, they don't have a context from which to understand your SSP and how you approach your CMMC obligations. So give them that context. Introduce yourself so they understand who they're speaking with and what you do. Humanize yourself and give them a clear picture of what your company is and what it does. What I recommend is you create a presentation, share a copy with the assessment team. In it, introduce your company and what it does. And if you make something like magnesium alloy crush cartridges, explain what those are. Explain that they're used on the landing gear of fighter jets, including the F-35 and the F-22, and that their purpose is to absorb impact energy upon landing. I bet your assessment team probably didn't know that before you told them. Tell them how your company is organized. Provide an organization chart showing the people on your team and who will be participating in the assessment. And if your assessment is being conducted virtually, include pictures and a short bios of the assessor so that the assessors know who they're speaking with. Again, humanize yourselves. Tell them what your company specifically does for the Department of War. Explain how your business is structured and how CUI flows through the organization and who has access to it. Provide an overview of your IT environment and assessment scope so they have context when you get into the details. Are you a Google shop or a Microsoft shop? Do you have remote workers? Do you use virtual desktops? Again, let them see the forest before they start to examine the trees or even start looking at the leaves so that they understand and know what they're looking at. And one last thing I'd suggest, provide an overview of your change management process in your in-brief, because this is something that will be discussed in more detail during the assessment. It's something that's very important to demonstrating your ability to maintain continuous compliance as time goes forward. Now, a good in-brief can avoid questions during the assessment and can make things just go much more smoothly. And again, it's about providing context to the assessment team. But the in-brief is just the beginning. And so, Delora, how should an organization seeking certification think about the rest of the assessment and being prepared?
Well, without being too dramatic, uh, we might think about it, through choreography. Think of it as a Broadway show because, like I mentioned earlier, this is kind of your chance to shine. As long as everybody has rehearsed, they understand, what direction we're headed, and that they understand what their role is in the assessment. The anxiety comes from uncertainty. And so, for example, on one assessment, I had an IT manager and a security officer that continued to contradict each other about the patch management process. And so, you even through the screen, I could see the confusion and horror, almost laughter from the assessor as they're listening to this conversation. We literally just became an audience to their to their argument and disagreement. And so, it's really important for you to have at least rehearsed once or twice how these interviews and walkthroughs of the evidence are performed, because just like a play, when you've practiced and the lines become second nature, when you're well rehearsed, then the actual opening night becomes much easier. And from there, you just kind of gain a momentum about the show that you've produced, and the outcomes are a lot better in the long run. What you don't want is to have, as an organization seeking certification, a surprise during one of those walkthroughs of the evidence, for example. So I think it's really, you know, it's about the preparation, as you've talked about, Stuart. Showing them who you are requires you to understand what your role is, and how the controls are performed and how they're documented. And if you're mature in these practices, then then it shouldn't be that hard.
Yeah. So when it comes to rehearsal, what do you think about organizations kind of conducting a practice or a mock assessment ahead of their actual C3PAO assessment?
For sure, as a registered practitioner, I offer those mock assessments, and I also know that C3PAOs offer mock assessments prior to the full assessment. And so there's plenty of opportunity. There's also your peers and cohorts and partners in industry. If you have friends that are also in this industry and have to have these assessments, seek feedback and or practice with them if you have the opportunity.
Yeah. I think all of that will make opening night kind of more successful, right? Uh,
Definitely.
and so just kind of switching topics, I know we talked about documentation before and how to make sure you have all the documentation that will be required because the assessment team is going to ask for it and they're going to want to see it. But Rachel, how can an organization seeking certification make documentation their friend during the assessment?
Good question. Well, a lot of that documentation you will have provided before the actual assessment, active assessment phase. You provide your initial body of evidence to include system security plan and policies, procedures, uh, all that documentation up front. And then during the actual assessment, what happens is when we are doing that interview uh, uh, technique, then we're going to be asking questions about the document set that we've already reviewed. Because if we've reviewed the document and there's an issue with the document, then we'll mark that as a failure, communicate that, and move on. We're not going to continue to test to see if that process is in place if the process that's defined is not accurate, right? So then throughout the assessment you'll provide documentation sprinkled in, maybe something you didn't provide a screenshot or a certain output, like a report in your initial set of documentation, but through the interview process we will pick up on certain things and request additional evidence. And so don't play hide and seek with your assessor. Don't intentionally lie, or withhold some key information. A good assessor will keep questioning the personnel responsible until they do get that full image of the control that has been implemented and are satisfied with the evidence results. But do know if like to be prepared. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little feedback here for someone. All right, so and um just be prepared to get additional evidence requests or additional documentation requests throughout the way, based on what your response was in that interview. And then that initial evidence set that you bring up front, as well as what you're providing throughout the assessment phase, is what's telling that documented story of the control and the process that you put in place. So good documentation is very strong to prove maturity and continuous implementation. And it if you can trace your documentation back to the individual control requirements and provide that level of information to your assessor um, very clearly without confusion, it will help paint that picture and avoid additional tangent conversations or lines of questioning. If so, do be prepared. Is all I'm saying is when you go into that assessment, and not only be prepared in your interview, but make sure your documentation set matches what the expected interview responses will be and what is in your system security plan.
Great. And Rachel, with all the documentation that exists, what are the things that, an OSC can do to make it easier for the assessment team to be able to find a specific piece of documentation when they're in the midst of a particular control or assessment objective?
Right, right. So referred to as a documentation response or traceability matrix. And it can be done in your system security plan, which I've seen, and that really works for some organizations, where in your system security plan you clearly identify that evidence, that output that will prove that you are meeting that requirement. but I've also seen it in spreadsheets where, because it can get quite complicated, you have different technologies, and so you need pieces of evidence for each technology that you have at play. So you can end up, collecting a lot of evidence for one requirement. And then, of course, there's tools like Future Feed where we do document traceability, evidence traceability for you in the background. And when in Future Feed you export your body of evidence, it will provide an Excel spreadsheet that lists all of the evidence that's in that file and what control requirements that evidence is being provided for. So that very clear of here's my evidence and this is why I'm providing it for will help paint that picture.
Yeah.
Um,
But and that way your evidence isn't playing hide and seek from the assessor when the assessor is looking to find it. So, uh, and yeah, and I know you talked about making documentation accessible. I think that it's important for people to understand they can play a role in directing the assessment team to the documentation that they're asked to see. And the best way to do this is to make each process that you talk about kind of into a story in the course of the assessment. If we look at one requirement, for example, 3.9.1 in personnel security, it requires that you screen individuals prior to authorizing access to organizational systems containing CUI. And so if you're being asked about that, start by telling the story. Explain that screening is covered in your onboarding policy. Explain that you've documented the procedure for background screening, that there is a discrete procedure for it. Explain to them the procedure, perhaps starting with the acceptance of an offer. The offer is accepted, HR creates a ticket in Zendesk. That starts the process to notify the outsourced screening firm to contact the employee. The firm contacts the employee by email. The email contains a link to a background web form for them to complete. The firm then conducts the background check and returns a report which was reviewed by HR. And if the background check is clean, the Zendesk ticket is closed, which triggers the next step in the onboarding process. Well, if you kind of tell that story, the evidence an assessor may ask for could be the policy and procedure. They could ask for a Zendesk ticket that shows the process being opened and closed. They could ask for a copy of the email that is sent to an employee and a copy of the web form. They could also ask for a copy of a report returned from the screening firm. But the point is that by telling the story, you've helped guide the assessment team to the documentation of the evidence you want to show them. And again, this will make the assessment process go more smoothly. Uh, and again, despite all of the planning and the preparation that we talked about, organizations, do make mistakes. And there are some common mistakes that you've seen companies make, haven't there? Oop, and Delora, you're on mute. There we go.
I gotcha. I alluded to earlier was inconsistent subject matter expertise answers. If definitely you need to iron out how you're going to respond prior to the assessment interviews, and they should be aligned to your policies and procedures and the evidence that's provided. So there really is little room for ambiguity by the time that you're at the interview process. The other would be outdated or incomplete evidence. If you just did a tooling upgrade and the evidence that you've provided is from your previous tool set, then you're probably going to want to refresh that evidence. Or incomplete evidence, we just talked about the onboarding process. If you're unable to produce evidence that you actually get the background check completed, then that would be an example of incomplete evidence. And then another one is just oversharing, right? Where some folks, when interviewed, get so nervous about making sure that they're thorough and complete that they tell the assessors everything, including that for the patching example where there was a disagreement on how patches were done. It all came down to having a lost password, and so a lot of the patching wasn't being completed because they didn't have the password. And so that would be an example of oversharing that your self-imposed denial of service.
Okay. And kind of related to oversharing, and I guess it's really related is knowing when to stop talking and quite bluntly when to shut up. And if you answer the assessment team's question and you hear silence, it's not because they're waiting for you to say something more. It may be because they're actually writing down the things that you said, they're recording their results, they're making notes. And I think the problem is that silence makes people uncomfortable and they feel compelled to fill the silence. And if you volunteer more information, if you say, oh, yeah, one more thing I should mention, and then you go on to talk about something else, as Dolores said, you're oversharing. You're inviting the assessment team to ask you more questions, to ask to see different evidence. And when you've answered the assessment team's question, stop. Make silence your friend. I know I participated in assessment where someone broke the silence and volunteered information they shouldn't have. And without getting into the specifics, let me just say that they seized defeat from the jaws of victory when it came to passing that particular control. So, know when to stop talking. So I know we've covered a number of things, Rachel, but what additional advice is there for OSCs in preparing for their assessment?
Well, I think we've pretty much covered most of what I have bulleted here, but it's just all really important points to really be prepared for that assessment. Because being prepared, like we said, having that evidence ready, having the right people engaged and on the assessment schedule and at work, not on PTO that day to be interviewed and speak to their responsibilities for implementing the requirements. Having the right people around to call if something needs to be escalated, or if you need some more evidence from your external service provider, having that person on standby to be able to produce that evidence if they don't have the time to sit in that full 8-hour interview session for the day. So just being prepared in all the ways we've discussed today is really going to help, almost like you can lead the assessment, like you scheduled it, you leaded it, like you're setting the pace, you're setting the tone, you're controlling the narrative, reducing any surprises, and overall just going to increase the efficiency and reduce stress of that whole assessment process. But I do want to just add here, from because we keep talking about evidence and documentation, and I hear and I know, because I've been on the implementer side and I've had to do ISO work, is that the documentation or the evidence collection process and just maintaining that documentation is quite a heavy load. It's a lot of hours collecting that evidence, but don't think of it as just needed for your assessment. That evidence can be used in multiple ways in your environment. So I'm going to give you a little trick or tip here is in the CA family, in the certification security assessment family. Of NIST 800-171, that's where you see the requirement to have your system security plan. But there's also requirements for continuous monitoring and requirements for annual security control assessments. And then you got CMMC that now requires annual SPURS attestation and putting that scores in there. And so all of those things essentially boil down to you evaluating if the control is the process that you put in place to meet the requirements. You're evaluating if that control is still implemented, the people are still doing what they're supposed to be doing, and it's working effectively. And then as you're doing that evaluation for continuous monitoring or annual security control assessments, you're going to be looking at evidence to do that own internal analysis of your own. Just keep it, save it in a folder. So that way throughout the year, as you're completing certain activity, you're logging that output. And that now will help you do all those internal evaluation assessments. And if we had a assessment scheduled in a couple months, your body of evidence is going to be pretty well built out. So that evidence, and if you define the evidence very clearly, the people at your company who have to do continuous monitoring and the internal assessments, that whole process is itself cut down. Because let's say, oh, I'm going to evaluate 319, the personnel background requirement. And in my system security plan, it very clearly states HR team does this level of screening on this time frame per this checklist, and then it lists out your evidence. So now, instead of reevaluating for certain like continuous monitoring activities, instead of reevaluating your whole design, your whole control, your whole documented process, and if that meets the requirements, your continuous monitoring effort just looks like, oh, okay, I see that they are doing that process because I see a whole list of the completed forms in this folder. So they're doing it. There's one put in there last week and one in there the week prior. So that would be part of your continuous monitoring. So I just wanted to throw that out there because a lot of evidence is needed for the C3PAO assessments, but it's also extremely valuable for your internal efforts.
Yeah. And I think part of your point is, knowing what you need is important so that you're, ensuring that you have all of that. And to what Dolores said, if we've kind of implemented this, made this kind of part of the culture of the company, all of that stuff should exist because it's been created for the company really to have a security program more than a compliance program. So great. So I know, we talked earlier about the certification assessment process, and we said that among its objective was to ensure that the assessments are conducted consistently by C3PAOs and their assessment teams. But it actually is important that you're careful about the C3PAO you choose to work with. And Delora, can you explain, why that is and what an OSC should consider when selecting a C3PAO?
Mhm. Well, the first thing is you want to make sure that they're accredited and authorized. And
Yeah.
so you want to check their status on Cyber AB Marketplace. And then you might consider their experience and expertise, because if you're speaking a language that's completely foreign to the assessors and they've not a lot of experience in that particular size and scope, then it could be a heavier lift for you to explain your body of evidence. So it's just helpful to know that they've done an organization like yours, if possible. And you want to make sure that your assessor has a clear, structured plan, that it isn't, a hunt. um, it should be a smooth engagement. And be wary of low bids because they may indicate a lack of thoroughness. There is a marketplace for this, and so now that we have a November 10 date for starting to get things added to the contracts, we can expect that there will be bad actors who try to take advantage of that as well. And so we want to make sure we weed those out by looking at some of the obvious things like an obviously low bid. And to that end, also reputation and references. If possible, ask for references from past clients and find out about their experience. What was it like? What were the interviews like? How did they manage the documentation? How often did you have to produce evidence that wasn't initially asked for? What was their overall impression of the assessor? Um, because ultimately they should be a partner, right, and communicate to you effectively, and they should be willing to answer questions and work collaboratively.
Is it worth asking an assessor whether they're familiar with your particular technology stack? I mean, if you're using Google and the assessment team kind of is, Microsoft centric, I mean, is that an important thing to consider and understand?
I think anything that adds to the assessor's understanding of your organization prior to them assessing it is probably helpful. I mean, if you're well versed in one technology stack over another, the assessments are generally going to be easier for you to get through the demonstration of the evidence if they're already familiar with how that technology stack works.
I think that makes sense. And probably the same thing may be true of if you're using a managed service provider, have they assessed, are they familiar with inherited controls from that particular managed service provider? So again, I think there's a number
Mhm.
of things that, that one, may consider. So I know as we wrap things up, I mean, first, Rachel and Delora, I want to thank you for your insights or your comments today. And let me just try to summarize some of the key points that we've covered during the discussion today. When it comes to preparation and evidence gathering, don't let those become fire drills. Make them part of your everyday business rhythm. Tell the assessor who you are and what you do. Your in brief is an important opportunity to give context to the assessment team. Prepare your lines in advance and rehearse. And don't make the assessment team play hide and seek when they're trying to find the evidence and documentation they want. Uh, Tell stories, but also know when to stop talking. And finally, it's important to choose your C3PAO wisely. So, and with that, I mean, let me remind you to sign up for future episodes of our Future Feed Explorers webinar series. And you can also replay past episodes on our YouTube channel. And before we get to questions, I'd like to share one more important resource that is available to everyone here to help prepare for CMMC. Uh, that we've been asked by the Cyber AB to share that the CS5 conference, the official conference of the Cyber AB, will be held in National Harbor in Washington, D.C. on October 16th and 17th. This is an opportunity to be able to hear directly from Katie Arrington, from Stacy Bosjanek, from Buddy Dees, from Matt Travis. It's an opportunity to attend educational sessions and to get access to essential resources that can really help you. And they have provided a discount code for those attending our webinars. And I know that there is a special price of $299 that has been set for verified defense contractors. So again, this has been an excellent conference in the past and something that, again, I'd suggest that you may want to take advantage of. So, and yeah, that's the information on CS5. So let me kind of get to some of the questions that we've received in the time that we have. Delora, a question for you. How do we know what to rehearse? Do we have someone go through each of the control requirements and say, tell me about, and, just kind of how does somebody rehearse? What do they do? We talked about a mock assessment. Maybe you could
Mm-hmm.
explain that.
When I do a mock assessment, I take a look at those not poemable controls. If you can't poem them, those are the ones I want to practice first, because you know that they're not allowed to be carried over. But yeah, I think that the suggestion there, tell me about, is probably the same methodology that we use as assessors. Tell me about this process. Tell me about how you do this.
So it really would be paralleling or kind of replicating the assessment process as if a C3PAO were conducting it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So Rachel, here's a tough question for you. What are
Mm-hmm.
cyber GRC tools?
Oh, geez. What are they? What are they? So those are, it's a term, a suite of tools out there that help you manage compliance, specifically risk governance, policy, procedure, cyber frameworks. And so Future Feed is, we like to say, a GRC-like tool. We don't have the full suite of risk, like a risk register, risk tracking, risks analysis, risk acceptance in the tool yet, but maybe in the future. But there's a
And
lot of tools out there. And if you're on the OSC side of the house and working on implementing these requirements, purchasing some tools like Future Feed, or there's several out there that really automate a lot of the administrative workload that comes along with developing, maintaining, managing, and continuously implementing the requirements, while in the background maintaining your system security plan, POAM, and other essential
Right.
documentation that's needed.
And Rachel, in the Q&A, there is one very specific
Mhm.
future feed question. If you wouldn't mind maybe just typing an answer to that one, and we'll cover some of the other general questions that we've received. Delora, a question that was submitted to us earlier. Where can I find a list of authorized C3PAOs? And is there anything Yelp-like that will help me choose who is right for me?
Well, the Cyber AB Marketplace is the place that I check. Stuart, is there another place?
I think that's the go-to place. Every
Okay.
authorized C3PAO, and I think as new ones are authorized, they get added to the Cyber AB marketplace. We can include the link to that
Right.
marketplace in the follow-up email that we do send out after this. Rachel, how long does the assessment process take? I think you touched on this during your comments.
The whole entire process, talking preliminary proceedings to um, certification, is roughly, well, it really depends, right? Because if you didn't have any poamable findings during that assessment, you don't have to worry about the 180 days to close out, remediate, reevaluate that requirement. But I think average total process 4 to 6 weeks. If we're talking actual assessment, the active assessment where the C3PAO is meeting with you either in person or virtually to conduct assessment methods, then it really again depends on the size of the company and complexity of the environment. I guess not really size of a company, but complexity of the environment overall. The more tech stack you have, the greater length the assessment will be, because we have to evaluate compliance on your whole tech stack in use. So we're talking 3 days for a very simple environment with maybe a lot of FedRAMP authorized inheritance, to a couple weeks for some
Uh,
very large companies with multiple physical locations.
So it sounds like the answer to the question, how long is an assessment, is like asking how long is a piece of string, right? It depends on a lot. So, and two questions maybe to combine them for Delora. One, our team is already stretched thin. Everyone has a day job. How do we prepare for an assessment without burning everyone out? And related to that, it sounds like a lot of work. How much time should we plan to prepare for our assessment?
Those are tricky. But I will say that this is it's not an assessment, it's a cultural change, it's a program. And so if you're lacking the resources to begin, you're going to be lacking the resources to maintain. And so seek resources. As a one individual, begin with a charter, saying that this is a program. A charter is a formal document that establishes something as a program instead of a project. A project has an end date. Um, and so the program will be defined as to what its purpose is and who the roles and responsibilities belong to. And that's one vehicle you can use to get the organizational support you need for the resources that are needed to maintain this over time.
Very good. And so you have a question. So it says we're seeing that CMMC level 2 could still be a self-assessment contrast to a C3 PAO audit. Any insight on to know your organization whether an audit will be required or if it'll be a self-assessment? First of all, within 48 CFR, there was a reestimate by the Department of War in terms of the number of organizations that will need C3 PAO level 2 assessments versus those that will need or will be allowed to do only self-assessments, and the percentage of those only with self-assessments is very, very small. Like from memory, I think it was about 2%. So if you're handling CUI, have to be level 2. Safe thing is to probably assume that you are going to need to go through a C3 PAO assessment. When will you know? The answer is, you won't know whether CMMC requirements exist in your contract until the solicitation or contract comes out, and you won't know whether it's a C3 PAO or a self-assessment until that period of time. Let's see, just trying to think. I think we've got
I
time
could
for.
add to that, and
Yep.
unfortunately, I don't have the actual title or release date, but I do know that the DoD, DOW, within the past year or less, has released some of their own internal guidance that they follow on determining level CMMC level. So if you just know, I've seen it out there. I've seen it on folks
Yep.
posting about it on LinkedIn. So if you search for it, you should be able to pull it up.
Yeah, and I think it kind of generally went that if it goes through the air or under the water, or if it goes boom, assume that it's going to require a C3 PAO assessment. Last question, Rachel, should procedures be separate or should they be part of the SSP, or should they be separate?
Your procedures can be part of your SSP or they can be separate. It is really up to you. I think some of the smaller companies, when doing consulting, less documentation works out for them. And so we do end up combining documentation. I don't like to put a lot of procedures or lengthy narrative into the system security plan. I like to point to other documentation just so it's clean and clear. But it's really it's up to the organization, and I would say make that determination based on who's using that documentation. How readily does it need to be um, available to the people responsible for using it? Are they going to be able to find those specific
Right.
procedures that they need to follow without searching through a whole slew of information or documentation? So that is completely your call. I would recommend they be external though, so you can make them operational and share them
And,
with
and I
them.
think, and I think sometimes it comes down to who within your organization you're planning to have or give access to. The SSP is a very sensitive document where you may want to restrict who has access to it, where policy or a procedure, especially something like an acceptable use policy, certainly everybody within the organization you're going to want to allow to have access to. Uh, well, again, Delora, Rachel, thank you very much. Thank you to everybody who's joined us today. We didn't get to all the questions. We will prepare and submit answers to all the questions that we did receive in an email. So again, thank you all for joining us today.